During a season filled with glittering balls, whispered ambitions and careful expectations, Prince Edward had never intended to fall in love. Known as a charming rake and future king, he had arrived at the first ball determined to remain detached until he met Lady Amelia Ashford, the luminous daughter of a duke, admired by many but untouched by ambition. From their first quiet conversation to stolen moments on moonlit terraces, Edward found himself drawn irresistibly to her gentleness, intelligence, and quiet strength. As Viscount Harrington pursued her with calculated determination, Edward chose a different path, courting her patiently, protecting her subtly, and loving her openly. By the time he escorted her to the grand gala as his companion and claimed her with a devoted kiss beneath crystal chandeliers, the entire court understood. The Rake Prince had chosen his future. Yet even as Amelia rested safely in his arms, another man was already planning, and her greatest test was still ahead. The morning after the gala dawned bright and restless. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Harrington House, glinting off polished surfaces and embroidered draperies, yet none of it brought Viscount Harrington any comfort. He had slept poorly, his thoughts circling endlessly around the same humiliating image, Edward escorting Amelia through the conservatory, introducing her with quiet authority, claiming her place at his side without apology. He had not merely attended with her, he had chosen her, publicly, decisively, and everyone had seen it. By mid-morning, Harrington was pacing his mother's sitting room, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight with restrained agitation. "This cannot continue," he said sharply. "I have pursued her honorably for weeks. I have made my intentions clear. And now he steps in as though I never existed." Viscountess Harrington regarded her son thoughtfully over the rim of her teacup. "He is the prince," she reminded him calmly. "He may do as he wishes." "He should not," Harrington snapped. "Not when I have already established myself." She set her cup aside. "Then you must secure your position," she replied. His eyes narrowed. "That is exactly what I intend to do." That afternoon he arrived at the Ashford residence with unusual urgency. The Duchess received him in the drawing room, where sunlight filtered through lace curtains and fresh lilies perfumed the air. She noticed at once that his usual confident composure was strained. "My lady," he began after only a few pleasantries, "I wish to speak to you frankly." She inclined her head. "Of course." "I love your daughter," he said firmly. "My intentions are unwavering. I wish to marry her, and I am prepared to do so immediately." The Duchess hesitated. "You know I value your devotion," she replied carefully. "But Amelia is being influenced," he interrupted quietly, "by attention that cannot be guaranteed." Her gaze sharpened. "You mean the prince?" "Yes," Harrington replied. "With respect, Your Grace, princes are subject to politics. Alliances change. Favor shifts. I can offer her certainty, stability, a secure place." He leaned forward slightly. "And I believe she deserves that." The Duchess folded her hands. "You are very persuasive," she admitted, "but my daughter's happiness will follow," he insisted, "if you encourage her." Silence stretched between them. She did not answer him at once, but he sensed hesitation and pressed harder. Across the city, in the quiet study adjoining the royal apartments, Edward stood before his parents with resolute calm. The king leaned back in his chair, watching his son carefully. "You seem unusually serious this morning," he observed. "I am," Edward replied. The Queen set aside her correspondence. "About Amelia," she said gently. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. He crossed the room and stood before them both. "I'm ready to propose," he continued, "formally, respectfully. with your full blessing." The Queen's eyes softened. "And you are certain?" "Completely," he replied. "She is my future. I will not consider another." The king studied him for a long moment. "This is not infatuation," he said slowly, "not habit, not rebellion." "No," Edward agreed, "it is choice." He drew a steady breath. "I have never been more clear-minded in my life." The Queen rose and came to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "You love her," she said, quietly. "Yes." "And she loves you?" He smiled faintly. "I believe she does." The king exchanged a glance with his wife, then nodded. "You have our blessing," he said simply. "Proceed with honor." Relief flooded Edward's chest. "Thank you," he replied softly. That evening, Amelia sat beside her mother in the family sitting room, embroidery resting forgotten in her lap as she listened to the Duchess speak. "Lord Harrington is eager," her mother said gently. "He has renewed his request for my approval." Amelia's heart tightened. "And what did you say?" she asked quietly. "I told him I would consider it," the Duchess replied. Amelia lowered her gaze. "Mamma," she said softly, "I cannot marry him." Her mother sighed. "I know, my darling, but you must understand. There are realities." Amelia lifted her eyes. "I understand them," she said, "but I also know my heart." The Duchess looked at her daughter and saw for the first time not uncertainty, but quiet resolve. "And where does your heart lie?" she asked. Amelia answered without hesitation, "With Edward." 2 days later, the morning Edward chose to formally seek Amelia's hand dawned clear and cool, the pale light of early spring filtering softly through the tall windows of the palace. He rose earlier than usual, though he had scarcely slept, his thoughts restless and unwavering in their purpose. There was no uncertainty in him, no doubt about what he intended to do, but there was a profound awareness of what this moment represented. Once he stepped across that threshold, there would be no retreat, no return to ease or anonymity. He would be claiming his future openly, and he welcomed it. He dressed with deliberate care, selecting a dark blue coat embroidered subtly with silver thread, formal without being ostentatious. When he fastened his cuffs, he paused for a moment, steadying himself, thinking of Amelia's quiet smile, of the warmth in her eyes when she trusted him, of the way she had leaned into him during their last dance as though she belonged nowhere else. By the time he entered his carriage, his resolve was unshakable. The Ashford residence was already awake when he arrived. Servants moved quietly through the halls, sunlight glimmered across polished floors, and the scent of fresh flowers drifted from open windows. Edward was received at once and shown into the Duke's private study, a room lined with bookshelves and framed maps of the family's estates. The Duke rose from his desk when Edward entered. "Your Highness," he said respectfully. "Sir," Edward replied, inclining his head, "thank you for receiving me." They seated themselves opposite one another, a small table between them bearing untouched tea. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Edward folded his hands and met the older man's gaze. "I have come today," he said calmly, "to ask for your daughter's hand in marriage." The words settled into the room with quiet finality. The Duke studied him closely, not with suspicion, but with the careful attention of a father who understood the gravity of what was being offered. "You are certain," he said slowly. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Edward replied. "I love her. I respect her. I intend to build my life around her happiness and her dignity." The Duke leaned back slightly. "You understand what marrying my daughter means," he continued. "She is not merely becoming your wife, she is becoming part of the crown. Her life will never again be private. She will be judged endlessly. Edward did not hesitate. "I will stand between her and any harm I can," he said quietly, "and where I cannot, I will stand beside her." The Duke's expression softened. Silence followed. At last, the Duke rose and extended his hand. "You have my blessing," he said. Relief surged through Edward's chest. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. Later, Edward requested a private moment with Amelia. They met in the small conservatory at the edge of the garden, where sunlight streamed through glass panels and climbing roses brushed against white stone walls. She stood near a window reading quietly. When he entered, she looked up at once. "Edward?" He crossed the room slowly, stopping before her. "I have spoken to your father," he said gently. Her heart skipped. "And?" "He has given his consent." She inhaled sharply. "Oh," he smiled softly. "Amelia," he continued, taking her hands in his, "I did not wish to wait for a spectacle or an audience. I wanted to ask you privately, as myself, not as a prince." Her eyes glistened. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you since the night I first heard you laugh without trying to impress anyone. I love your intelligence, your gentleness, your courage, and the quiet strength you carry without ever displaying it. I want to spend my life earning your trust and protecting your joy." He lowered himself slowly to one knee. "Will you marry me?" Tears slipped down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." He rose at once and gathered her into his arms, holding her as though he had finally come home. Unbeknownst to them, Harrington arrived at the Ashford house scarcely an hour later. He had come armed with prepared speeches and renewed determination, convinced that persistence would yet prevail. Instead, he was met by the Duchess in the drawing room, her expression composed but resolute. "You are too late," she said gently. His heart sank. "Too late?" he echoed. "My daughter is engaged," she continued, "to Prince Edward." For a moment he could not speak. Then he bowed stiffly. "I see." And for the first time, he truly did. That evening, Edward and Amelia stood together on the terrace, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Our lives are about to change," she murmured. "They already have," he replied, drawing her close, "and I wouldn't alter a single step." She smiled against his shoulder. Neither would he. The engagement was not announced immediately. Edward insisted on waiting, not because he feared reaction, but because he wanted the moment to be right. He wanted Amelia to feel prepared, protected, and secure before the world was invited into what belonged, first and foremost, to them. For several days after his proposal, they remained quietly secluded, moving through familiar spaces with new awareness, as though everything had shifted by a single, irrevocable degree. He walked her to the door each evening and lingered longer than necessary. He wrote her notes in the mornings, even when he knew he would see her by afternoon. He held her hand more often, more openly, no longer disguising his need to be close to her. She noticed, and she loved it. The Queen summoned them both to her private sitting room on a mild afternoon, sunlight streaming through tall windows and illuminating the pale gold fabrics that lined the walls. A small table had been set with fine porcelain and fresh flowers, though neither Edward nor Amelia was particularly interested in tea. They sat together on the sofa, their fingers intertwined. The Queen regarded them quietly for a moment. "You are very certain," she said at last. "Yes," Edward replied simply. Amelia felt his hand tighten around hers, not in nervousness, but in quiet emphasis. The Queen smiled. "Good," she said, "then we shall proceed." The announcement was arranged for the following evening. A formal reception was scheduled in the palace's grand reception hall. Invitations were extended widely, ensuring that all of London's most influential families would be present. Rumours spread at once. Speculation blossomed. By the time guests arrived, the air was thick with curiosity. Amelia stood in her chamber as her maid adjusted the final fold of her gown, her reflection gazing back at her with unfamiliar intensity. She wore soft ivory silk, simple in design, but exquisite in craftsmanship, accented only by Edward's diamond at her throat and the delicate ring upon her finger. Her engagement ring. She lifted her hand slightly, still marvelling at it. "Nervous?" Edward asked, gently, from behind her. She turned to find him watching her from the doorway, dressed in formal black and silver, his dark hair neatly styled, his expression unmistakably proud. "A little," she admitted. He crossed the room and took her hands. "Look at me," he murmured. She did. "You belong with me," he said quietly. "Nothing that happens tonight changes that." Her eyes softened. "I know." "And I belong to you," he added, publicly, completely. Her breath caught. They entered the reception hall together. Conversation faltered. Music softened. Every gaze turned. Edward did not slow. He guided Amelia forward with calm authority, his hand resting possessively at her waist, his posture unmistakably protective. He greeted guests with polite ease, never releasing her, never allowing her to be separated from him even for a moment. The message was clear. She was his. At the appointed moment, the king rose. Silence fell. "My friends," he began warmly, "tonight we celebrate not only diplomacy and alliance, but something far more personal." He gestured toward Edward and Amelia. "My son has chosen his future." Edward stepped forward. Amelia felt his arm tighten around her. "Lady Amelia Ashford," he said clearly, his voice steady and resonant, "has agreed to become my wife." Gasps rippled through the room. Applause followed, then cheers. Edward turned slightly toward her, his gaze unwavering. "She is my heart," he continued, "my partner, my home, and I will spend my life proving myself worthy of her." Tears filled her eyes. She lifted her chin. "And I," she replied softly, "am honored to stand beside him." The Queen joined them, placing her hands over theirs. "Welcome, my daughter," she said. Across the hall, reactions unfolded. Some ladies whispered excitedly, some mothers recalculated futures, some suitors quietly accepted defeat. Viscount Harrington stood very still. He bowed his head and walked away. Later, on a quiet balcony overlooking the illuminated gardens, Edward drew Amelia into his arms. "You were magnificent," he murmured. "I was terrified," she confessed. He smiled against her hair. "I was not," he replied. "I have never been so sure of anything." She rested her forehead against his. "And now everyone knows." "Yes," he said softly. "And no one will ever doubt again." He kissed her slowly, possessively, devotedly, permanently. After the announcement, nothing in London remained quite the same. From the very first morning after the reception, he refused to allow even the smallest doubt to linger about her place beside him. He arrived at the Ashford residence unannounced before noon, sending the household into polite chaos, and insisted on escorting Amelia personally to a charity committee meeting hosted by the Queen. "You needn't come yourself," she protested lightly as he took her cloak. "I want to," he replied, fastening it around her shoulders with careful hands. "And I dislike being separated from you for unnecessary reasons." Her cheeks warmed. "That sounds suspiciously like possessiveness?" He smiled slowly. "It is." At public gatherings, Edward made no attempt to disguise his attention. He seated her beside him at official luncheons, leaning close to murmur observations in her ear. "You look dangerously beautiful today," he whispered once during a particularly dull speech. "Edward," she scolded softly, "people can see us." "Let them," he replied, his gaze lingering on her mouth. "I enjoy reminding them." She blushed every time, and he delighted in it. Amelia, however, was far from overwhelmed by her new position. When foreign ministers spoke too quickly, she followed without effort. When social rivals attempted subtle slights, she countered with elegant precision. When charitable boards hesitated, she presented thoughtful proposals that left them impressed and compliant. Edward watched her with barely concealed pride. One afternoon, after she calmly dismantled a patronizing remark from a visiting noblewoman using nothing but polite logic and impeccable courtesy, he leaned toward her. "Remind me never to argue with you in public," he murmured. She smiled sweetly. "Only in private?" He laughed softly. "Especially in private." In private, however, he remained entirely, unapologetically hers. He stole kisses in quiet corridors, pressed his forehead to hers when she was tired, held her hand during long evenings without explanation. Sometimes, when she was speaking animatedly about a book or a charity project, he would simply watch her, his gaze dark and intent. "What?" she asked once, catching him. "You," he replied. "I still cannot believe you chose me." Her expression softened. "As if I ever had another choice," she teased. He pulled her closer. "You always had a choice," he said quietly. "You chose me anyway." The Duchess, observing all of this, finally laid aside her last lingering doubts. One evening, as Amelia prepared to leave for a small concert with Edward, her mother paused her at the doorway. "He makes you shine," she said quietly. Amelia smiled. "He lets me be myself." The Duchess nodded. "That is rarer than devotion." Perhaps the clearest sign of Amelia's acceptance came during a grand, diplomatic dinner at the palace. A minor lord, emboldened by wine and poor judgment, attempted to monopolize her attention, speaking over her and ignoring Edward entirely. Edward allowed it for precisely 30 seconds. Then he rose, placed his hand at Amelia's waist, and said pleasantly, "You have had enough of her time." The man flushed. Your Highness, she is engaged to me," Edward continued calmly, "and she is bored." Amelia tried, and failed, not to laugh. Edward guided her away without another word. Later, she touched his arm. "You were very bold." "I was restrained," he replied. Her smile widened. Late one evening, after a long reception, they slipped into the palace gardens alone, moonlight spilling across marble paths and sleeping roses. Amelia removed her gloves with a sigh. "I never imagined being this visible," she admitted. Edward drew her into his arms. "And yet," he murmured, "you command every room." "Only because you stand beside me." "No," he corrected softly, "because you are extraordinary." He tilted her chin up and kissed her slowly, deeply, claiming and reassuring all at once. "You are my future," he whispered against her lips, "my queen, my heart, my home." Her voice trembled. "And you are mine?" He smiled, satisfied. By the end of those weeks, no one questioned her place. She was not merely accepted, she was established, chosen, adored, and fiercely protected by a man who had never loved anyone before her. Once the engagement had been announced and society had settled into its new understanding, life did not slow. It intensified. Preparations for a royal wedding were not quiet affairs. They unfolded with layers of protocol, expectation, tradition, and political significance, each one demanding attention and careful negotiation. Committees were formed, schedules were drafted and redrafted. Designers, planners, and advisors filled palace corridors with murmured consultations. Yet through it all, Edward remained unwaveringly focused on one thing: Amelia. He insisted on being involved in every major decision, not out of control, out of devotion. When fabric samples were presented, he sat beside her, running his fingers thoughtfully across silk and lace. "This one," he murmured once, lifting a pale ivory swatch. "It feels like you." She smiled at him. "How does fabric feel like a person?" "Soft," he replied quietly. "Strong, beautiful without trying." Her cheeks warmed. Dress fittings became their own quiet ritual. She would emerge from the dressing chamber nervous and luminous, while Edward waited nearby, pretending to be patient and failing utterly. The first time he saw her in the near-finished gown, he forgot himself entirely. He rose from his seat without realizing he had done so. Amelia paused. "Well?" she asked softly. He crossed the room in 3 strides and stopped before her. "You are going to ruin me," he said quietly. She laughed. "That seems dramatic." "It is accurate," he replied. His gaze traced her slowly, reverently, possessively. "Every man in the kingdom will envy me," he added, "and they should." She, in turn, watched him transform. The former Rake, once so casually charming, so effortlessly detached, now approached every responsibility with focused seriousness. He reviewed ceremonial procedures late into the night, practiced vows in private, consulted historians and clerics to ensure every tradition was honored properly, all for her. One evening she found him seated at his desk, surrounded by papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You've been working for hours," she said gently. He looked up at once. "I want everything perfect," he replied. "For the kingdom," she teased. "For you," he corrected. They stole time whenever they could. Short walks in palace gardens, quiet meals in private chambers, moments in shaded alcoves. Edward rarely missed an opportunity to touch her, a hand at her waist, fingers brushing her sleeve, his thumb tracing slow circles against her palm. "You're impossible," she murmured once as he pulled her closer during a quiet evening reception. "You love it," he replied. She did. At night, when the palace quieted and the world receded, they spoke of their future: children, residences, charitable foundations, travel. "I want a home where you feel safe," Edward said once, "where you can breathe." "With you, I always do," she replied. He kissed her slowly then, as though sealing the promise. The final weeks passed in a blur of fittings, rehearsals, and quiet anticipation. Invitations were dispatched across Europe. Choirs practiced daily. Florists transformed entire wings of the palace. And still, Edward never lost sight of her. On the morning of the final rehearsal, he found her standing alone in the cathedral, sunlight pouring through stained glass. "You're thinking," he observed. "I'm realizing," she replied softly, "that everything is about to change." He stepped behind her and wrapped his arms around her. "Yes," he said against her hair, "and I will spend my life making sure it changes only for the better." By the time the wedding day approached, there was no uncertainty left in either of them. No hesitation, no fear. Only devotion, only anticipation, only 2 hearts fully aligned, moving steadily toward forever. The morning of the wedding dawned in quiet splendor. A pale mist hovered over the palace gardens, drifting lazily between rose trellises and marble fountains, while sunlight filtered slowly through soft clouds, as though the day itself were taking its time. Bells rang distantly across the city, their sound gentle and anticipatory, carrying the promise of celebration. Within the palace, however, there was nothing gentle about the activity. Servants hurried through corridors, seamstresses made final adjustments, advisors whispered instructions, musicians rehearsed one last time. And in a sunlit chamber overlooking the gardens, Amelia stood before her mirror, utterly still. Her gown lay against her, like a dream woven into reality. Ivory silk flowed in graceful lines embroidered with delicate vines and blossoms that shimmered faintly when she moved. A sheer veil rested against her golden hair, fastened with small diamonds that caught the light. She scarcely recognized herself, not because she looked different, but because she looked complete. The Duchess stood behind her, her hands resting gently on Amelia's shoulders. "You are radiant," she whispered. Amelia smiled softly. "I am loved." Her mother's eyes filled. "I know." Across the palace, Edward prepared in near silence. He stood at his chamber window, watching sunlight creep across the lawns, his formal coat draped over a nearby chair. When he finally dressed, he did so with deliberate care, fastening each button as though sealing a vow. Thomas entered quietly. "You look serious," he remarked. Edward smiled faintly. "I'm about to marry the woman I love," he replied. "I think that allows for seriousness." "And excitement?" Thomas added. "That too," Edward admitted. The cathedral filled slowly. Light streamed through towering stained glass, scattering jewel-toned patterns across marble floors. Thousands of white roses lined the aisle, their fragrance drifting upward toward vaulted ceilings. Guests whispered, heads turned, hearts waited. Edward stood at the altar, tall and composed, though his pulse thundered beneath his calm exterior. His gaze remained fixed on the entrance, anticipation sharpening every sense. Then the doors opened, and the world disappeared. Amelia stepped forward on her father's arm, luminous beneath her veil, her eyes shining with quiet emotion. Each step she took toward him felt like a promise being fulfilled. Edward's breath caught. She was his. She had always been his. And now she was coming to him. When she reached him, her father placed her hand in Edward's. "Take care of her," he murmured. "With my life," Edward replied. The ceremony unfolded like poetry. Vows were spoken with steady voices and trembling hearts. Rings were exchanged, warm and golden in their hands. Blessings were given beneath arches of light. When Edward lifted her veil and kissed her, the cathedral erupted in applause, but for them, there was only each other. The reception shimmered into life beneath open skies. Lanterns floated among trees. Music drifted through warm evening air. Tables overflowed with flowers and crystal. Edward barely left Amelia's side. He danced with her, laughed with her, whispered to her. At one point, he drew her into a quiet alcove, his hands settling possessively at her waist. "You are mine," he murmured. "And you are mine," she replied softly. He kissed her then, slow and deep, promising everything he had ever been and everything he would become. The last carriage departed long after midnight. Its wheels faded into the distance, leaving behind only silence and moonlight and the soft sigh of fountains in the palace gardens. Inside, servants moved quietly through the corridors, extinguishing candles, gathering flowers, restoring order to spaces that had held so much joy. And slowly, gently, the world began to recede. Edward and Amelia slipped away without announcement, without ceremony, escorted only by soft lamplight and discreet attendants who bowed and vanished at the first opportunity. Their hands remained intertwined. Neither had loosened their grip since the final dance. Not once. They walked side by side through familiar halls that now felt different, as though the palace itself had shifted to accommodate their new reality. Doors opened soundlessly. Curtains stirred in the evening breeze. Somewhere, far away, a clock chimed the hour. Edward slowed as they reached their chambers. He stopped before the doors. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Her hair had loosened into soft waves. The diamonds still glimmered at her throat. Her cheeks were faintly flushed, her eyes luminous with exhaustion and happiness, and something deeper, something private. "Are you all right, my love?" he asked quietly. She smiled. "I've never been better," she replied. His chest tightened. "My wife," he murmured. She reached up and touched his cheek. "My husband." Inside, the room glowed with warm candlelight. Petals had been scattered across polished floors and linen-draped furniture. Curtains stirred softly at open windows. A faint scent of roses and lavender lingered in the air. It felt like a sanctuary. Edward closed the doors behind them, and for the first time all day, they were alone. Truly alone. Amelia stood very still, suddenly aware of the enormity of the moment, all the guests, all the ceremony, all the expectations gone. It was just them now. Edward crossed the room slowly. "You've been brave all day," he said softly, smiling, greeting, standing before everyone without flinching. She laughed quietly. "I was terrified." "I know," he replied. "And you were magnificent." He lifted his hands and gently removed the remaining pins from her hair, letting the golden waves tumble freely down her back. "I've wanted to do this since this morning," he admitted. She smiled shyly. He helped her out of her cloak first, then slowly, carefully, loosened the delicate fastenings of her gown. His touch was reverent, as though he were handling something priceless. "You're trembling," she murmured. "So are you," he replied. He slid the gown from her shoulders, letting it fall softly to the floor. She stood before him, vulnerable and radiant and completely his. His breath caught. "Amelia," he whispered, "I will never be worthy of you." She stepped closer and placed her hands against his chest. "You already are." She began unfastening his coat in return, her fingers brushing his skin, her touch tentative but determined. When she finished, she rested her head briefly against him. "I trust you," she whispered. His arms closed around her instantly. They kissed then, not hurried, not demanding, slow and deep and certain, a kiss that said, "I'm yours. I choose you. I'm home." Edward lifted her gently and carried her towards the bed, laying her down as though she were made of light and silk. He followed her, surrounding her with warmth and strength, his presence both protective and adoring. They explored one another with wonder and patience, learning every breath and sigh and quiet response, discovering how perfectly they fit, not only in body, but in spirit. There was no urgency, only connection, only belonging, only love. Much later, when candles had burned low and moonlight traced silver patterns across the ceiling, Amelia lay curled against Edward's chest, his arm wrapped securely around her. His fingers traced slow, absent-minded patterns along her back. "Do you know," he murmured, "I used to think marriage would feel like surrender." She lifted her head slightly. "And now?" "Now," he said quietly, "it feels like victory." She smiled and pressed a kiss to his skin. "I feel safe," she whispered. "You always will," he replied without hesitation. "With me." He tightened his hold slightly, as though sealing the promise into his bones. Outside, the palace slept. Inside, two hearts rested together at last. Not as prince and lady, not as suitors, not as dreams, but as husband and wife, chosen, claimed, forever. Morning came quietly. Sunlight slipped through sheer curtains and rested gently across pale linen and golden hair. Somewhere in the gardens below, birds began their soft, tentative songs, welcoming a new day that felt different from any that had come before. Amelia stirred first. For a moment, she lay very still, half lost in dreams, half aware of warmth and safety surrounding her. Then she felt it, the strong arm around her waist, the steady rhythm beneath her cheek, the unmistakable presence of the man who had become her home. Edward, her husband. She smiled. Carefully, she lifted her head and studied him. In sleep, he looked younger, softer. The lines of responsibility and command faded, replaced by simple peace. One hand rested protectively against her back, as though even in rest he refused to let her go. She traced his jaw lightly with her fingertip. He stirred at once. He murmured. "You're awake." "Yes," she whispered. "I didn't want to leave this moment." He opened his eyes and smiled at her, that slow, devastating smile that had undone her from the beginning. "Neither did I," he replied. He drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead, then her temple, then her lips. "My wife," he murmured. "My husband," she answered. In the weeks that followed, their marriage settled into a beautiful rhythm. They rose early and walked in the gardens before the day claimed them. They shared private meals whenever possible, speaking of small things and great dreams. They debated policies and poetry with equal enthusiasm. They laughed often. They touched constantly. Edward never lost his possessive devotion. If anything, it deepened. He still placed a hand at her waist in crowded rooms, still leaned close to whisper teasing remarks, still watched her as though she were the only woman in the world. "You're staring again," she teased once. "I'm appreciating my good fortune," he replied. She blushed every time. Years passed. Seasons turned. Crowns were placed. Edward was crowned king beneath ringing bells and thunderous applause. Amelia standing proudly at his side, her hand steady in his. When he placed the crown upon her head, his voice trembled. "My queen," he whispered. "My love," she replied. On quiet evenings, long after ceremony and crowds had faded, they would sit together on palace balconies watching lanterns drift across darkened gardens. Sometimes she would rest her head against his shoulder. Sometimes he would pull her into his arms without a word. Always. They were close. "Do you ever think," she asked him once, "about that first night at the ball?" He smiled. "Every day." "And?" "I thank fate," he replied softly, "that I was bored enough to notice you." She laughed and kissed his cheek. "And I thank fate," she said, "that you were brave enough to choose me." He held her tighter. "I will always choose you," he promised. And he did. In every decision, every challenge, every season, they remained what they had always been. Two hearts, one devotion, one forever. Chosen, claimed, loved, always.